Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the fourth and final installment of this year's Vermont Forest Health webinar series. Very excited today. We have a great talk from Steve Faccio, a conservation biologist and co-founder of the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. He's going to be talking to us today about the status of Vermont's forest birds and Vermont Forest Bird Monitoring Program that's been established at the Vermont Center for Ecostudies and how forest health plays into that. So should be a really great talk. It's always nice to have a wildlife talk in here as well. So I'm looking forward to it. Today's webinar is available for one SAF, CFE, as well as Vermont Licensed Forester credit. There is not a pesticide credit associated with today's talk, nor is there an ISA credit. But if you have questions about that, you can feel free to email me or Kate4. Let's see. So if you've attended these webinars before, you know that at the end of the webinar, when you close out, there should be a survey that pops up that will allow you to put your information in to get those credits that you're looking for. If it does not pop up when you close out, you will receive an email in the following days with a link to that survey so that you can get that credit. So fear not if you close out and the survey does not pop up, but hopefully it will. One other housekeeping item is that all questions for today's webinar should be entered into the questions box in your GoToWebinar side panel there. So please write those in, and at the end of the webinar today, I will collect all those and ask Steve these questions verbally. So feel free to put those in at any time during the talk. But without further ado, I'll pass it over to Steve Faccio. Really looking forward to this. Thanks again for joining us, and take it away, Steve.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Josh. Appreciate the invite today, and it's a great time of year to talk about birds as our neotropical migrants have been streaming in the last week or so. It seems like every morning I wake up to a new song out the back window. Yeah, I'm going to talk about an analysis I did a few years ago, 25 years of data from the Forest Bird Monitoring Program here in Vermont. And I guess I won't be directly talking about forest health, but indirectly we'll certainly touch on some forest health issues and topics and how they relate to birds. So with that, I'll start with the first slide here. Birds are the most diverse vertebrate group in our forested ecosystems, and they bring color and voice to a predominantly quiet green landscape. So they're always a welcome addition out there in the spring forest. And I think we'd all agree that forest birds need forests, but there's also a growing body of evidence to show that forests need birds as well for the variety of ecosystem services that they provide, including pollination and pest control, seed dispersal, and nutrient cycling. So keeping track of birds through long-term monitoring is really a critical step toward gaining a broader understanding of forest ecology and forest health. So the Vermont Forest Bird Monitoring Program was established in 1989, and the primary goal of the project was to monitor the status and population trends of interior forest birds. So there are other monitoring projects, particularly the North American Breeding Bird Survey, that monitors birds along roadways and does an excellent job of monitoring birds across a continent-wide scale. And in Vermont, we have something like 17 or 20 roughly breeding bird survey routes throughout the state. But again, those are roadside surveys. So we wanted to monitor in interior forests, away from the edge effects of open habitats and development and roads. So that's why we started the Vermont Forest Bird Monitoring Program. So it's, as I said, it started in 1989 with these 11 study sites scattered around the state. They were kind of hand-picked as some of the finest examples of interior forest sites around the state. And then over the years, I added additional study sites. So by 2012, we were up to 31 study sites. And as of this year, we added one new site, so we're up to 32. And again, these are all in interior forests, and for the most part, they're in unmanaged forest stands. Not that forest management is bad for birds necessarily, but it does introduce another variable that can be hard to tease out whether population trends you're seeing in the birds is related to broader changes or is it related to site-specific changes because there's been logging going on or other kinds of forest management. So we try to select sites where there won't be forest management going on. So here's a breakdown of our study site, the forest community types. So the biggest chunk is northern hardwoods, which kind of mimics the proportion of northern hardwoods across Vermont, the most common forest type in the state. And then a pretty good chunk of oak maple, primarily there in the Champlain Valley and down in the Taconics in southwestern Vermont. And then we have a couple of coniferous wetlands in the Northeast Kingdom and some deciduous wetland sites as well, like Cornwall Swamp and a few other large deciduous wetlands. And then the breakdown of ownership of these study sites is a 50-50 split between public lands and private lands. And most of those private lands are private lands, but with public access. And then if we look at that ownership a little bit differently, the largest chunk of the public lands are Vermont state lands, primarily wildlife management areas. But we do have some sites on forest and parks lands, state forests. And then we have a pretty good chunk of government, federal government, primarily Green Mountain National Forest. And then the largest chunk of the private is conservation NGOs. Like we have a lot of study sites on the Nature Conservancy preserves and a few other NGOs like Merck Forest and a few others. A small number on university lands. We have several on UVM natural areas and one at a study site that's owned by Sterling College. So that's the breakdown of how most of our study sites are owned. And the way our sites are set up, one site consists of 5 survey points, each spaced about somewhere between 200 and 250 meters apart, and at least 100 meters from any forest edge. And we try to keep the points in similar habitat as far as the age class of the forest and the cover type. So if they're in northern hardwoods, we try to keep all 5 of those points in similar northern hardwood cover and age class. And our procedures are pretty straightforward. These are called point counts, where observers, skilled birders will sort of adopt a site, and they go to their site twice a year during the month of June and conduct 10-minute point counts at each of those 5 points. And during that 10-minute count, they identify all the birds they see or hear. And it's primarily hearing. Probably 95% of the birds that are identified at our points are heard. We don't see that many actually. So you have to be pretty skilled at identifying birds by ear. And this is largely a volunteer project. Most of our study sites are adopted by volunteer birders who want to contribute their time towards this long-term monitoring project. So for this 25-year analysis, we estimated population trends by developing mixed effect statistical models in program R, with count as the response variable and year as a fixed effect. And then we also included observer and site as random effects in the model. And then we limited the analysis to just those species with at least 100 detections on at least, and they occurred on at least 5 study sites. So moving right on to the results of this 25-year data set was from 1989 to 2013. So it's a few years old, but we analyzed almost 2,500 point counts, at which just over 32,000 birds were detected of 125 species, for a mean of about 13 birds per point. And the overall picture was of a long-term decline over that 25-year period. So here we have year on the bottom axis and just the number of birds per point on the vertical axis, just plotted out over a time series. And we had an annual trend of decline of about 0.6% a year, which over 25 years equals about a 14% decline in just the relative abundance of all species at all study sites lumped together. And the biggest part of that decline occurred kind of in the first decade or so of this 25-year study. And then it's sort of leveled out in the more recent, in the last 10 years or so. So we modeled trends for 34 species and 12 ecological guilds of birds. And here are the species that we developed trends for. We look at the bottom. So we had 8 species that showed increasing trends. I won't go through all 8 of those, but we're going to look at some of these in greater detail, but not all of them, just in the interest of time. And then if we look in the upper left, we had 13 species that showed decreasing population trends. And then on the right, an equal number, another 13 species that showed no change, no population trend, nothing significant in their numbers. And then again, we modeled trends for 12 ecological guilds. These are sort of groupings of birds that share some sort of ecological similarity. So whether it's their breeding style or where they forage or how they forage for prey, or their migratory strategy, whether they're long distance, short distance migrants, etc. So we had 7 of those 12 guilds showed declines. Those are the guilds listed in orange. That included single brooded species, which are primarily long distance migrants and short distance migrants, aerial insectivores, low canopy foragers, so those birds that forage in the mid-story or the low canopy, migratory, we had neotropical migrants and short distance migrants. Both of those guilds showed significant declines. And then birds that nested in the canopy and those that nested on the ground. And only 2 of these guilds showed increases. Those are the birds that foraged on the ground and those that foraged in the high canopy. So kind of an interesting juxtaposition there of increases and decreases on canopy and ground species. And then 3 guilds showed no trend at all. The bark probers, woodpeckers, and related species, residents, year-round residents, and then shrub nesters. So let's take a look at some of these in a little more depth. And we'll start off with the good news, with some of those increasing trends. So we had these 4 species show increasing trends. And in all these graphs, you'll see, again, the vertical axis is just the mean number of individuals per point and year across the bottom. And then the 95% confidence intervals are the shaded areas. So we had red-eyed vireo, yellow-bellied sapsucker, black-throated green warbler, and ovenbird showing strong increasing, statistically significant increasing trends. And that's good news for a couple of reasons. One, these are among the most abundant and widely distributed and also easily detected species on our surveys. So they're all very common. In fact, red-eyed vireo and ovenbird are the 2 most commonly detected species on our surveys. So that just gives us a lot of confidence in the data that the data are good and that these trends are biologically significant as well as statistically significant. As also the fact that they're fairly easy to detect. They all have fairly loud songs, fairly easy to identify It's not, you typically don't mix them up with other species too easily. So they're, again, our confidence is good for these species. And all of these also occupy different habitats and ecological niches, which suggests that, Vermont forests are providing a wide range of habitats for our birds. So red-eyed vireo is an interior forest specialist primarily and a canopy forager, whereas yellow-bellied sapsucker is more of a second growth or forest edge species and a bark prober. Black-throated green warbler prefers mature mixed forest, so it likes to have a little bit of both deciduous and coniferous forest, and its forages primarily in the canopy. And then ovenbird prefers mature deciduous forest and is primarily a ground forager and a ground nester. And all of these species are listed as species of regional conservation concern by Partners in Flight, which is a consortium of state and federal agencies and academia and NGOs that work together to conserve birds and sort of set regional priorities and for conservation. And we're going to move on to the bad news, right off the bat here, and talk about some of these declining trends. So as a group, these 4 species reached their highest abundance on our surveys in forested wetlands, and they showed very low counts right around the year 2000, between about 1998 and 2002. Very low counts during those years, which corresponds to the spread of West Nile virus across North America, which has been shown to have persistent impacts on bird populations. And it seems like if any habitat was going to be a high risk for West Nile virus, it would likely be forested wetlands. So, and also 3 of these 4 species are regional concern species for Partners in Flight, and 1, Canada warbler, is a high priority species of greatest conservation need in Vermont. So these trends are fairly concerning, and Canada warbler has been a high priority species in the Northeast region for since we started the forest bird monitoring program, and their populations just really do not seem to be rebounding. And then these 3 species, Blackburnian warbler, winter wren, and yellow-rumped warbler, reach their greatest abundance in coniferous wetlands, on our coniferous wetland sites. They are found in other habitats, but on our surveys, their greatest abundance is on coniferous wetlands. And sort of surprisingly, these don't show that signature West Nile virus counts or signature low counts as the others in deciduous wetlands did. But if we look at 5 out of the last 7 we just talked about, including winter wren here in the upper right, and then the 4 on the previous slide, 2 of these are regional concern. So 5 of the 7 we just talked about nest and feed on or near the ground. So winter wren and 4 in the previous slide, veery, white-throated sparrow, common yellowthroat, and Canada warbler, are all understory or ground nesters and feeders, which may suggest that there's something going on related to understory structure. Does it have anything to do with our forests becoming more mature or over mature, some might say, so that the understory structure is a little less diverse maybe, or a little less understory structure? It also brings to mind that could there be effect at some of our sites from earthworms? All the earthworms here in Vermont are non-native. Were introduced species, and many of them are very invasive and have a big effect on the on the understory. They can reduce the organic matter in the herbaceous layer of the forest floor pretty dramatically. They can relocate carbon lower down in the soil profile, change habitat structure so that there's much less, understory woody growth as well as less herbaceous cover. And they can also alter the soil temperature and the moisture regime in the soil surface, which can have a big effect on the abundance of arthropods that some of these ground feeding birds might be focusing on and feeding on. Now, a lot of our interior forest sites don't have earthworms, but there are some of our sites do have earthworms, and there could be some effect that's spilling over. The one thing about monitoring is it often raises lots more questions than it answers. It gives us information, but it raises a lot of questions that we need to investigate more fully. And then these two species, the eastern wood pewee and the great crested flycatcher, showed some of the strongest declines, particularly the great crested flycatcher in any of our declining species. And again, notice these two show what may be an effect of West Nile virus around the on either side of the year 2000. West Nile virus, I think, was first detected in the late 1990s. Was first detected in Vermont in 2000, but may have been here before then. And unfortunately, this group, both of these species are aerial insectivores, and as a group, aerial insectivores showed the most dramatic decline of any group that we looked at, showing a annual trend of about 2.5% decline and a 25-year trend of 45% decline in this group of birds that feed exclusively on flying insects. And this mimics a nationwide trend that's really quite alarming. And the species listed in the upper right are the aerial insectivores that the 11 species that we had on our surveys. We didn't have many of these in great numbers because most of them are not really forest birds, but we did have least flycatcher, pewee, and great crested flycatcher, as well as olive-sided flycatcher in reasonable numbers. The others just in smaller numbers. But this is a group that also includes species that are quite dissimilar from most of these, things like whippoorwill and common nighthawk. And as I said, it corroborates a widespread trend across North America that's been reported as early as 1993 by other researchers. And all of these folks have found that the declines have been most prevalent here in the Northeast, and that they appear to be strongest among long-distance migrants. And many of the aerial insectivores are long-distance migrants. And this guild exhibits a really wide range of diversity in life histories and ecology, which, as I mentioned, includes things like whippoorwills and nighthawks to the swallows and swifts and the flycatchers. The one thing they share in common is their feeding strategy, and that is they feed exclusively on insects that are flying. So they don't glean insects or caterpillars off of foliage. They only catch insects that are flying, insects on the wing. So this suggests that these declines are probably linked to changes in populations of flying insects as opposed to habitat changes that would affect the nesting birds. Or it could also be phenological mismatch. So that's a phenomenon where, because of climate change, generally there's a the timing of events is no longer matching for a variety of ecological species. So, for example, if flowers are blooming earlier, the insects might not be becoming active at the right time to take advantage of those flowers and pollinate flowers. And so that's an example of phenological mismatch. So for example, if these aerial insectivores are arriving back on their breeding grounds and the insect populations have already become active or delayed for some reason, that phenological mismatch can have a big effect. So there's a lot of research going on to try to better understand this dramatic decline of aerial insectivores. So far, there hasn't been any consensus on what is driving this. Although there does seem to be consensus that we are in a period of big insect decline, and you've probably heard about the so-called insect apocalypse, and a lot of attention is being paid to pollinators these days, and for good reason. So there was the New York Times magazine had this article, that there's been articles in the Atlantic and Science Digest and a whole bunch of other publications about the worldwide decline in insects. And largely this got started from these results out of Germany, where they studied the biomass of flying insects that were collected each year in monitoring traps in nature reserves in northwestern Germany. And over a period of 27 years, a very similar time frame of this study that I analyzed, this study was 1989 to 2015, I believe. They showed an 82% decline over that 27-year period, and of just flying insects. And the species that declined the greatest were those species that appeared in midsummer, just at the time when aerial insectivores are needing that biomass to feed their nestlings. And of course, there's a whole range of potential causes for this decline in insects. Pesticide use is an obvious one. Changes in agricultural practices, particularly the introduction and use of genetically modified crops. Climate change is another fairly obvious and prominent one, as well as polarized light pollution, which was a new phenomenon to me a couple of years ago when I first discovered it in these two papers by these Hungarian biologists, particularly Horváth and Kriska and others, where they introduced this idea of polarized light pollution and actually showed some results of how it's having an effect on insects. And I found it compelling and just thought I'd spend a little bit of time talking about it, since I don't hear too many other people discussing it. So to understand polarized light pollution, first we need to understand a little bit about polarized light. So sunlight itself is unpolarized, but when sunlight is reflected off of smooth, stark surfaces, particularly water, but also could be cliff faces or large areas of rock or vegetation, it becomes partially linearly polarized, where again, water is one of the strongest natural polarizing surfaces. And so polarized light pollution is light that has undergone polarization by reflecting off of artificial surfaces. So insects are adapted to see polarized light because many of these flying insects breed in water. So it helps them to locate their breeding sources. But when light reflects off of these artificial surfaces that are so ubiquitous on the landscape, these can act as ecological traps for many aquatic breeding insects. So some of these surfaces, that artificial surfaces that polarize light, include automobiles, paint, the dark paint jobs on automobiles, photovoltaic solar panels, buildings particularly, and of course glass. And then the black plastic, especially where it's used in these industrial agricultural landscapes where they use huge amounts of this black plastic to keep weeds down in croplands. And then highways and roadways. And to aerial insects, our roadways must just look like rivers to them, where the light is reflected off of these dark surfaces. And so again, insects can be attracted to these things, and of course, if they're attracted to roadways, they can be killed by the millions along highways. But they also lay their eggs on surfaces that are not going to result in successful breeding. So in the upper right, there are some insect eggs that were laid on a car bumper, and the bottom right here is a Dobson fly that's actually laying its eggs on a paved road. So a real concern for these aerial insects. There seems to be a real concentration of problems going on that's having a combined effect, causing this worldwide decline. So these results kind of give us an opportunity to think about how we can manage for some of these declining species. So we can use forest management as a tool to provide habitat that will help some of these declining species. So I always think that a good management strategy is to try to emulate natural disturbance in both scale and frequency. So natural disturbance regimes, as opposed to sort of the way we think about forest management for timber products. So if we think about the natural disturbance regimes here in the Northeast, those tend to be things like ice storms or wind events, sometimes pest, outbreaks of certain forest pests that will cause a defoliation event. And those are on pretty small scale, tend to be, and they usually tend to be over a fairly long time scale. And if we, it's also good to strive for stand level heterogeneity. So not to have really homogeneous stands of forest. So a real mix of tree species and age classes, which provides for a variety of birds. And these 3 or 4 management strategies are good to use to achieve that kind of stand level heterogeneity. Crop tree release with canopy gap formation, single tree or small group selection, and expanding gap shelterwood. These are all silvicultural practices that will provide small little gaps in the forest and produce structural diversity within the forest. And these all will benefit these 6 species, which have all showed significant declines in our data set. And then it's also a good idea to think about using best management practices for controlling and eliminating invasive species, including earthworms. There are some good management practice for trying to at least eliminate the spread of earthworms. Once they're present, it's pretty hard to eliminate earthworms, at least as far as I'm aware. But try to avoid spreading them from site to site. So just a brief summary of some of our results. So overall, we had a 14% decline in the relative abundance of birds. And again, the biggest The biggest chunk of that decline occurred in the first half of our study period. And so about a quarter of the 34 species that we modeled trends for increased, and most of those were priority species under partners in flight, and half of them were neotropical migrants. But a greater number, 38% of those 34 species showed declines. Nearly half were partners in flight priority species, and greater than half, more than half, were neotropical migrants. And that high proportion of neotropical migrants is a good reminder that these long distance migrants face multiple threats throughout the year. So there's a lot to consider. We have to consider the full life cycle of these migratory birds in evaluating what the limiting factors are. So it might not be that the limiting factor in what's driving their population declines might not be here in the Northeast on their breeding grounds. It could be on their overwintering grounds in the tropics. It could be their stopover sites on their, in between breeding and wintering. So or it could be a combination of all of those or a couple of those. So there's a lot more to. It's a pretty complex situation to try to tease out what the limiting factor is and what's really driving some of these trends. But we had an equal number of species that remained stable, and if you combine those species that remained stable with those that increased, that's kind of a good picture. Most of our birds either increased or showed no change. So that's something we can see that's good news. We did have this alarming decline of aerial insectivores that corroborated, a North American-wide picture. So we do have concerns about that group of birds. There could be some effect of West Nile virus that is affecting some species, and we had a high proportion of forested wetland birds declining, 70% of which were ground or shrub nesters, feeders. And these are birds that concentrate their activities in the low understory or on the ground, suggesting there could be change in understory structure that could be affecting them, whether it's earthworms or maturing forest. And obviously this could be a high risk habitat for West Nile virus as well. So I do want to acknowledge our funding for this 25-year study. The Forest Bird Monitoring Program, because our study sites are largely surveyed by volunteers, we're kind of operating on a shoestring budget. We don't, it's pretty hard to fund long-term monitoring, but what we get funding for are some of these intense analysis that we do every 10 or 15 years or so. So these foundations and a whole suite of private donors provided the funding for this particular analysis that was done a few years ago. And a big shout out to our nearly 60 birders who helped collect all these data over the last, well, it'll be 32 years, I think, this year that we've been running this project. So a big shout out to all these volunteers who have participated and helped us collect the data. So with that, I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you may have. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. That was really great. Yeah, lots of good information there about what's going on in our forests with birds and insects. So we had a couple questions come in the question box right now. I'd encourage others, if you have any, to continue to fill those in. But I'll start going down the list here. The first question says, it's interesting that aerial insects are declining in light of decreasing bat populations from white nose syndrome. Do you have any comment about that?
Well, we don't have, the declining bat population is somewhat, certainly not a worldwide phenomenon, right? It is concentrated primarily, as far as I know, it's just a North American phenomenon, and I don't know how far it's spread across the U.S. It was predominantly in the Northeast to start, and I'm not sure at this point how far it's spread. And we really have very poor information about aerial insects population trends here in this region. We do know pollinators have declined. We don't have great data, but we do have some data about pollinators. So while aerial, bats certainly do help to control some of these flying insects. And while their populations have declined, you would expect maybe some of these insects to expand their populations, but there could be there are a number of factors that could be driving those populations down, and that could be another factor that could be complicating the recovery for some of our bat species. We still do have the non-cave dwelling bats are doing fine. The big brown bats and a few of the others are still around and are doing okay. It's the cave dwelling species that are affected by white nose. So I don't have good answer for that, but we also don't have very good data on populations of flying insects in this region.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I think that does clarify that a little bit. The next question is about the decline of blue jays and whether that's linked to West Nile or if there are actually other factors suspected. And yeah, I'll follow up with another question after that one for you, Steve.
Yeah, we did show a significant decline in blue jays. I didn't discuss it because I really wanted to concentrate on the species that we had the highest confidence in. Blue jays are not a species I would say our survey does a great job of surveying, because blue jays are year-round residents. They nest pretty early. So by the time we're doing our surveys in June, they're kind of done with their nesting, really. They usually have fledglings by that time. So we did detect a decline, and West Nile virus has been shown to be really that blue jays and other corvids, other members of the crow family, like blue jays, are highly susceptible to West Nile. So that could be one factor that accounted for that decline. I just don't have real high confidence in our survey data for the blue jay decline that we see.
That's great, thank you. The follow-up, the second part of that question was about actually bird feeding and behavior related to solar farms. Is anybody perhaps here in the U.S. studying that, how bird feeding and behavior are affected by those?
I'm not aware of any current studies. There probably are, but I'm not aware of any. There was quite a bit of study, back in the early 90s that I recall, in late 80s, about bird feeders, and some range expansions for some species were attributed to bird feeders, particularly cardinals. The northward expansion of cardinals into New England was attributed to sort of the bird feeding phenomenon. And then there are also studies by Margaret Brittingham at Penn State, who particularly looked at chickadees. Her concern was bird feeding sort of helping these species survive, or were they just using bird feeders to sort of supplement their diet? And she found that it was the latter. They weren't dependent on bird feeders. They were just still getting like 75 or 80% of their diet they were getting from natural foraging in the forest, but they were supplementing their diet with bird feeders. And then, Josh, I'm sorry, did you ask about solar panels?
Yeah, that was kind of the crux of the question was like how is anybody studying bird feeding behavior around these like large
Oh,
scale solar farms?
yeah, yeah. There's some work going on in California where they have some really huge solar installations, looking at that because they are finding problems with birds flying into these PVC panels. And so there's been research done into that, and some of the aerial insectivores are focusing on the PVC panels, presumably because they're attracting insects because of the polarized light phenomenon. So there is some study going on. I haven't seen much in the way of results. I was just aware of there was a request for proposals not too long ago, just looking at that exact question. What is the scale of the impact? And then the bigger question was, how can we design solar panels to minimize or to mitigate the impact to direct mortality of birds by flying into them? So that was the project that I recall the most. I have not seen results though.
Got it. That's great. Thanks for that. The next question, we got a couple more here on West Nile virus. First of all, how come West Nile virus seemed to kind of disappear from the data there after 2013?
Yeah, well, there's one slide I didn't include in this. For some species, there seems to be like there was a hit from West Nile, and then they seem to recover. And then there were a few other species that sort of stayed low after their populations never seemed to really fully recover after that sort of impact of West Nile. And actually, I might have that slide, I think, at the end here. If I just flip through a bunch of these slides from other talks, I'll get to the end shortly here. Here we go. So here's the slide. The upper row seem to have persistent effects from West Nile. And then the bottom group of birds seems to have somewhat recovered after the impacts of West Nile. And I don't know if that's, I don't know what to attribute that to. I'm not I'm not up on the literature of West Nile virus these days. And if I know there is some, control going on in many areas, trying to keep insect or the mosquito populations down in some of the bigger wetlands, control for West Nile and Eastern equine encephalitis. So I don't know if that is having effect on some birds or if it's a habitat issue or what. So yeah, great.
No, that's great, Steve. You actually just answered the follow-up question that I had, which was, do you think the treating of the wetlands with insecticides to control for West Nile has had an impact on aerial insectivores? And it sounds like that is certainly a possibility.
Yeah, definitely a possibility. Yeah.
Yeah. I've got a few questions here that are kind of about the approach to the project in general. Somebody's asking, are you looking for more volunteer birders? And another person is asking how what they could do to help manage their property of 600 acres to benefit wildlife. What's the best thing to do to support bird species? I would imagine that's kind of on a site-by-site basis, but if there's some general things about that and whether or not you're looking for birders, maybe you can comment on both those things.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, happy to. Yeah, so currently we have, out of our 32 study sites, we did have one volunteer just recently found out that he can no longer continue. So we have one survey site available, which happens to be in one of these forested wetlands, Cornwall Swamp over in the Champlain Valley, which is a large red maple swamp. So if you like tromping around in swamps wearing either hip boots or knee boots, this was a great site for you. You need to be kind of tolerant of mosquitoes if you want to survey Cornwall Swamp. So yeah, but I'd be happy to talk to you if you're interested in participating. Get in touch with me at the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. You can find my email there. And then as far as forest management goes, my recommendation would be to get in touch with Audubon Vermont, who has some great programs for both sort of community programs to work with landowners on managing their forests with birds in mind. So they'll come out, they'll do a survey of your land, get a sense of what your forest consists of, and then they'll provide you with a report and offer some management strategies that will benefit birds. And they'll also work with your forester if you have one. So that's a great project. They have a program called Forestry with Birds in Mind, or Forestry for the Birds. So that's one. I have a new project going on right now, a short-term project going on in cooperation with Audubon Vermont and UVM, where we're looking at how to manage sugar bushes, commercial sugar bushes for birds and biodiversity in general. So are there ways of managing woods that are primarily managed for sap, for maple syrup production? Are there ways to manage them that will improve those habitats for birds and other biodiversity as well, while maintaining their productive for sap production?
Great, thanks, Steve. Somewhat related, this is actually a question I had to do a quick Google search on because I'm not familiar with this program. How is this study related to Birder Broker, which appears to be something through Audubon? I'm not sure if there's any connection between these two.
Yeah, so Birder Broker is actually a VCE project, Vermont Center for Ecostudies, in partnership with Bridget Butler, who's a private sort of consultant, the bird diva she's known as. So that project is more bringing birders to private landowners and just to find out what birds are in their woods and sort of bring awareness about what landowners might have on their property. And it doesn't necessarily have to be forest land. It could be fields or pasture land, or it could be early successional habitats as well. Audubon's Forestry for the Birds is a little bit different in that they come out and do a survey of your woodland to determine what species of birds are there and the state of your forest and how you can increase and improve the habitat for birds.
Great, thanks for that clarification. Let's see, the other question I have here is about site selection and the initiation of this study here. Was harvest history for the 20 to 30 years prior to the start of the study considered during site selection? The person asking the question is curious if some of the early population declines could be part of the forest structure changes from harvesting that occurred prior to the start of the study.
Yeah, that's a good question. Those first 11 sites that were established were quite mature. They were sort of the pick of the litter, so to speak, when they set up those sites. Chris Rimmer, our executive director at the Vermont Center for Ecostudies, was the person who brainstormed the idea of the Vermont Forest Bird Monitoring Project and initiated it back in 1989, and I came on in the early 1990s. So I wasn't around when it was first initiated, But those sites were all very mature when they established them. Sort of the best examples of either not necessarily old growth, but mature forest. So I don't think there was a whole lot of, in the previous 20 years, there probably wasn't a whole lot of forest management going on those sites. One of the sites we have is probably the best example of old growth in the state, which is called the Cape Research Natural Area on Green Mountain National Forest it's right on the Goshen-Chittenden town line. And it's a steep west-facing slope that appears to have never been logged, just because it's steep and fairly difficult to access. And I feel lucky to say that that's the site that I survey as part of this project. I've been going there for 30 years, twice a year in June. It's a wonderful place to tromp around, even though it's physically challenging to get into because it's such a steep slope. But it's a spectacular stand of old growth northern hardwoods. But that's a great question about pre-land use history.
Great, thanks, Steve. It sounds like a great site. I think that does it for what I have in the question box here. So I'll talk for one more moment here and let people put in a last-minute question if they have it. But I want to thank you again, Steve, for presenting this information today. It's really great to learn about this and hear what's going on with populations of birds and insects in the state. Folks that are still on the line, recall that when you close out, hopefully the survey will pop up if you are looking for credits. If not, don't fear, we'll have an email sent out to you in the next day or two, excuse me, that will allow you to get those credits. If you did attend last week's webinar, you will receive a certificate today, and it'll probably be yet another week delayed to get the certificates from today's presentation, but they'll be in your inbox eventually. So I want to thank you for attending. I want to thank Steve again, and I want to thank Kate Forer as well, who helps with all the behind the scenes work getting these webinars going. And recall that if you want to pass word about this webinar or any of the others from the series this year onto your colleagues or friends, you can find these on demand at ourvermontwoods.org, and you can view those and get credit for those as well. So it's a great platform to be able to use. Thanks again, and have a great week.